My billionaire in-laws treated me like a glorified nanny and threw my clothes on the lawn to protect the bloodline. They didn't realize I'm the secret beneficiary of the trust that owns their entire company. To the outside world, I was the luckiest woman alive. I married Julian Vance, the golden boy of the Vance real estate dynasty, but inside the gates of the Vance estate, I was a ghost. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, referred to me as the girl or the help whenever I wasn't in the room. They assumed I came from a trailer park because I had a scholarship to the same Ivy League school where Julian bought his way in. For 3 years, I played the part. I managed their social calendars, kept the house running, and endured Eleanor's etiquette lessons, which were really just refined insults. They thought I was a gold digger. They didn't know that my own father, Silas, had been the silent partner who actually funded their grandfather's first skyscraper. The only person who saw me was Julian's father, Arthur. He was a hard man, but he was fair. Before he passed away 6 months ago, he called me into his study. He handed me a simple, weathered key and a flash drive. "Maya," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "My children are vultures. My wife is a peacock. They have no idea how this empire actually stays standing. I've watched you. You're the only Vance with a brain. This key is to a safety deposit box in Zurich. Don't open it until they try to cut you out, and they will try." I held that key for months, watching Julian become more like his mother every day, arrogant, entitled, and increasingly cruel. A week after the 6-month anniversary of Arthur's death, Eleanor and Julian sat me down in the grand dining room. Beside them was the family's lead counsel, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of ice. "Maya, darling," Eleanor purred, though her eyes were cold. "Now that the estate is being finalized, we need to protect the Vance bloodline. We've drafted a post-nuptial agreement. It effectively waives any claim you have to the Vance holdings in the event of, well, the inevitable." Julian didn't even look at me. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, likely messaging the fitness influencer he thought I didn't know about. I looked at the document. It was a joke. It offered me a one-time payment of $50,000 to walk away from a multi-billion-dollar estate. "And if I don't sign?" I asked. Julian finally looked up, his lip curling in a sneer. "Then we move up the timeline, Maya. You're a great nanny for the house, but you're not Vance material. We've already had your bags packed." I looked at Eleanor. She smiled, the smile of a predator who thinks the trap is closed. I didn't sign. I stood up, walked out of the room, and went straight to the Zurich safety deposit box. In Zurich, I opened the box. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was the original founder's agreement of Vance International. It revealed that the Vance family only owned 49% of the voting shares. The other 51% was held by an entity called the Silas Trust, my father's trust. Arthur had spent 40 years managing it on behalf of my father, and in his will, he had named me, not Julian, not Eleanor, as the sole successor to the Silas Trust. I wasn't just a Vance wife. I was the majority shareholder of their entire world. When I returned from Zurich, I found my suitcases on the gravel driveway. The locks on the mansion had been changed. Eleanor stood on the balcony, a glass of champagne in her hand. "The car will take you to the airport, Maya. Don't bother calling Julian. He's already filed for an annulment based on fraudulent intent." I looked up at her, feeling a calm that should have been terrifying. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor. You haven't checked the bylaws lately." She laughed, a shrill, brittle sound. "I am the Vance legacy, you little brat. Now get off my lawn." I moved into a high-end hotel and called my own legal team. Not the Vance hacks, but a firm that specialized in hostile takeovers. "We need to schedule an emergency board meeting for Vance International," I told them. "Topic, change of leadership. And I want the invitation sent to Eleanor and Julian personally. Make sure they know it's mandatory." For the next 3 days, I audited the company's recent filings. Julian had been siphoning money for his influencer projects, and Eleanor had been using company funds to renovate her European villas. They weren't just arrogant, they were sloppy. I arrived at the Vance International headquarters at 9 a.m. I wasn't wearing the modest dresses Eleanor forced me to wear. I wore a bespoke navy suit and the watch my father had left me. I walked past the receptionist who used to ignore my calls. "I'm here for the Silas Trust seat," I said. She looked confused, but the moment she saw my ID, the color drained from her face. The security guard, who usually patted me down like a stranger, stood at attention. They knew what Silas meant, even if Julian didn't. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Eleanor was sitting in the chairman's seat, Julian to her right. They were laughing, probably discussing how they'd spent the $50,000 they thought I'd taken. When they saw me, Julian stood up, his face red. "Maya, how did you get past security? This is a private meeting for shareholders." "I know, Julian," I said, walking to the head of the table. "That's why I'm here. Since I represent 51% of the voting power, I believe I'm actually chairing this meeting." I threw the Silas Trust documents onto the table. The silence was so heavy you could hear Eleanor's pearls clicking against each other as she trembled. The family lawyer picked up the papers, his hands shaking as he scanned the biometric signatures and the Zurich seals. It's legitimate, Eleanor," he whispered. "The Silas Trust has the power to dissolve the board, appoint new officers, and audit all personal expenses for the last 10 years. I looked at Eleanor, whose champagne-soaked victory was now turning to ash. "Now," I said, "let's talk about the bloodline and who exactly is leaving whose house." The silence silence in the boardroom of Vance International wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a vacuum. Eleanor Vance sat frozen, her hand still reaching for her silk-wrapped planner, her mouth agape in a perfect O of aristocratic shock. Julian, ever the impulsive one, was the first to snap. He lunged across the table, his face a mottled purple that clashed with his expensive Italian tie. "This is a prank! You're a waitress from a scholarship fund, Maya. You don't own a trust. You don't even own the shoes on your feet because I bought them." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let him scream until his voice cracked, the same way he used to scream at the house staff when his coffee was 3 degrees too cold. I looked at the lead counsel, Mr. Sterling, who was sweating through his bespoke pinstripes. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice like a razor through silk, "since the Silas Trust has just exercised its right to an emergency executive session, I believe Mr. Julian Vance is currently in violation of board decorum. Security, please escort the former vice president of development from the floor." The doors opened, and the guards, men Julian had treated like furniture for years, stepped in. They didn't hesitate. They took Julian by the elbows and dragged him out while he shrieked about fraud and lawsuits. I turned to Eleanor. "Now, Eleanor, let's look at the quarterly projections. Or should we skip straight to the internal audit of your floral consultant fees?" While Julian was being hauled out of the building, I handed Eleanor a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a board report. It was a notice to vacate, because the Vance estate, the mansion, the grounds, and the secondary villas, was technically owned by a subsidiary of Vance International, and because I now controlled that parent company, I was officially her landlord. "You have 24 hours to remove your personal effects from the main house," I said. "And by personal effects, I mean clothes and jewelry purchased with your own inheritance, not the furniture or the art, which belonged to the Silas Trust." Eleanor looked at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. "You can't do this, Maya. Arthur loved me. He would never let his own wife be thrown on the street by a social climber." I leaned forward, looking her dead in the eye. "Arthur knew exactly who you were, Eleanor. He knew you were draining the company to pay for your bloodline prestige. He didn't love you, he tolerated you. But he respected me. And tomorrow morning, the locks on the mansion change again. Only this time I'm the one on the inside." She didn't scream like Julian. She simply gathered her purse, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't clasp the latch, and walked out with whatever dignity she had left. By 2 p.m., I had the company's CFO in my office. He was a man named Miller who had been cooking the books to hide Eleanor's personal extravagances for years. I didn't fire him, not yet. I needed his passwords. "Miller," I said, spinning my laptop around, "I see a recurring $40,000 monthly wire to an interior design firm in Paris. Our records show no Parisian properties. Who is that money for?" He stammered, looking for a way out. It's for Mrs. Vance's villa in Provence. She said it was a corporate retreat." "Freeze the account," I ordered. "And freeze the company credit cards issued to Julian and Eleanor. Also, send a stop payment to the fitness influencer Julian is currently housing in the Tribeca loft, which, by the way, is also a corporate asset. If they want to live like billionaires, they can start by using their own money, if they have any." By the time the markets closed, Eleanor's unlimited black card was a piece of useless plastic. I watched the notifications hit my screen as she tried to pay for a $12,000 lunch at the St. Regis. Declined. I felt a cold surgical satisfaction. I wasn't being petty. I was performing a long overdue audit of a parasitic system. I arrived back at the Vance estate at 6 p.m. The same driveway where my clothes had been thrown 3 days ago was now lined with security. I walked through the front doors, the heavy oak swinging open for me. Eleanor was in the grand foyer, frantically directing movers to pack the Ming vases and the original Monets. "Stop," I said, my voice echoing in the vaulted hall. "Those aren't yours, Eleanor. Everything in this house that was here before you married Arthur belongs to the trust, and everything bought with company funds stays with the company." "This is my home!" she shrieked, clutching a small Fabergé egg to her chest. "I spent 30 years making this place respectable." I walked over and gently took the egg from her hand. "You spent 30 years treating me like a servant while you lived off my father's ghost. You can take your clothes and your vanity. The rest is staying. Security will inspect every box that leaves this house. If I find so much as a silver spoon that belongs to the Silas Trust, I'll file a criminal report for grand larceny." I watched her deflate. The grand dame of New York society was reduced to packing her designer shoes into cardboard boxes. Julian didn't take the news as quietly as his mother. At midnight, I was woken up by the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I didn't panic, I had anticipated this. I walked to the top of the grand staircase and saw Julian in the foyer, a half-empty bottle of expensive scotch in his hand and a golf club in the other. He had smashed the mirror in the hallway, the one Eleanor used to check her pedigree every morning. "Maya," he roared, his voice thick with drink, "come down here and face me. You think you're the boss now? You're nothing. You're a fake." "Julian," I said, my voice calm and projected from the darkness of the landing. "I've already called the the police. They'll be here in 5 minutes. If you leave now, I might not press charges for breaking and entering. But if you hit one more thing, I'll make sure the annulment you filed is the least of your legal worries." He looked up at me, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and pathetic realization. He wasn't a man. He was a child who had been told no for the first time in 30 years. He dropped the club, slumped against the wall, and started to sob. He had lost his money, his mistress, and his pride. And he still didn't understand that he had lost them the second he chose to treat his wife like an employee. The next morning, the bloodline protection Eleanor so cherished became her noose. I leaked the results of the preliminary internal audit to the Wall Street Journal. The headline was brutal. Vance matriarch accused of multi-million-dollar corporate theft. By noon, every charity board in the city had sent her a formal resignation request. The Met Gala invitation she had been flaunting, revoked. The Junior League, canceled. She wasn't just broke, she was socially radioactive. I sat in the morning room, drinking tea from a cup that was now legally mine, watching the news. Eleanor tried to hold a press conference in front of her new apartment, a cramped 2-bedroom in a less than glamorous part of town. She looked haggard, her pearls missing, her hair unkempt. She tried to play the victim, but when the reporters asked about the $2 million she'd spent on private jets to the Maldives, she had no answer. She was a ghost in the making, and I was the one who had turned out the lights. The Tribeca loft was the next to be reclaimed. I went there personally. I wanted to see the woman Julian thought was worth more than his marriage. Her name was Tinsley, and she was 23, blonde, and currently crying into a $5,000 handbag. "You can't just kick me out," she wailed. "Julian said this was his apartment." "Julian lied," I said, handing her a trash bag. "This apartment is a Vance International corporate asset, and since Julian is no longer an employee, his housing allowance has been terminated. You have 1 hour to pack. Anything left after that will be donated to the local shelter." She looked at me with a mix of fear and confusion. She was just another victim of the Vance delusion, but I had no pity left. "Tell Julian I said hello," I added as I walked out. "And tell him the annulment papers he filed? I'm contesting them. I'm going for a full-scale divorce. I want to make sure the world knows exactly why our bloodline failed." As I dug deeper into the files Arthur left me, I found something that made my blood run cold. Arthur hadn't just died of natural causes. There were medical records tucked into the back of the Silas Trust drive that showed a series of prescriptions ordered by Eleanor's personal physician, medications that were contraindicated for Arthur's heart condition. Eleanor hadn't just waited for him to die. She had accelerated the timeline to get her hands on the estate before he could change the will. I sat in Arthur's study, the same room where he gave me the key, and felt a wave of cold fury. They hadn't just insulted me, they had murdered the man who tried to protect me. I called my lead investigator. "I need every medical record for Arthur Vance for the last 12 months, and I want a background check on Dr. Sterling. If Eleanor bought him, I want to see the wire transfer." The audit was no longer about money, it was about murder. It didn't take long for the house of cards to fall. Dr. Sterling was a man who liked luxury as much as the Vances. When my investigators showed him the wire transfers I'd found, disguised as consultancy fees from a shell company Eleanor controlled, he broke. He admitted that Eleanor had pressured him to adjust Arthur's dosage to ensure a painless passing. He had recorded the conversations as insurance. I listened to the recordings in my office. Eleanor's voice was unmistakable. "He's an old man, doctor. Why let him suffer? Just give him the sleep he deserves, and the foundation will ensure your clinic gets the funding it needs." I felt sick. My husband and his mother had killed the patriarch to inherit a throne that already belonged to me. I didn't call the press this time. I called the district attorney. The police arrived at Eleanor's new apartment at 6 a.m. I watched from a car across the street as they led her out in handcuffs. She wasn't wearing silk this time. She was wearing a cheap tracksuit she'd bought at a discount store. Julian was with her, looking like a ghost. He wasn't being arrested yet, but the look on his face told me he knew his time was coming. As the police car pulled away, I rolled down my window. Eleanor saw me. She saw the woman she called a nanny, standing in the light of the morning sun. "The audit is almost over, Eleanor," I whispered to the wind, "and the bloodline is finally clean." I drove back to the mansion, the Silas Trust key heavy in my pocket. I had the money, I had the house, and now I had the justice. The Vance legacy was dead. The Silas legacy was just beginning. Eleanor Vance was in Rikers Island, a place she wouldn't have visited in her worst nightmares, let alone lived in. But while the matriarch was neutralized, Julian was still a loose end. He was currently holed up in a cheap motel, trying to sell his watch collection to fund a defense for a mother who had already been tried and convicted by the public. I didn't want him in jail, not yet. I wanted him to see the world he thought he owned become a world that served me. I sat in Arthur's chair, the Silas Trust documents laid out before me, and realized that Julian's annulment was actually his greatest mistake. By filing for an annulment based on fraud, he had inadvertently opened his own financial history to the court for discovery. He had handed me the keys to his own prison cell. As the discovery phase of the divorce annulment began, my legal team descended on Julian's records like piranhas. We found that Julian hadn't just been siphoning money from mistresses, he had been front-running Vance International real estate deals. He would buy properties through a shell company just days before Vance International announced a development, then sell them back to the company at a 300% markup. It was textbook insider trading and embezzlement. He wasn't just a bad husband, he was a parasite on his own father's legacy. I compiled the data into a single devastating ledger. The Silas Trust didn't just own the company, it now owned Julian's freedom. I held a press conference in the lobby of the Vance building. I didn't stand behind a podium. I stood among the employees. The name Vance has stood for prestige, I told the cameras. But prestige without integrity is just a gilded cage. From this day forward, Vance International is becoming Silas Global. We are liquidating the lifestyle assets of the former board and redirecting $500 million into affordable housing initiatives. The stock price, which had been plummeting during Eleanor's arrest, suddenly stabilized and then soared. The market didn't want a bloodline, it wanted a leader. I watched the live feed in my office, seeing the Vance sign being lowered from the building. It was the most satisfying audit of my life. Julian tried to storm the building one last time. He didn't get past the lobby. I watched the security footage as he screamed at the guards, "I'm a Vance! This is my name!" He looked pathetic, a man defined by a name he never earned. I walked down to the lobby and met him face to face. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet but echoing in the silence of the room. "The name Vance is gone. You're just Julian now. And Julian is a man who owes Silas Global $42 million in restitution for insider trading." I handed him a summons. "The SEC is waiting for you in the parking lot. You wanted to protect the bloodline? Well, now you can protect it in the state penitentiary." Julian's trial was the tabloid event of the year. I sat in the front row, wearing the same suit I wore the day I was evicted. I watched as my lawyers laid out the founder's agreement and the evidence of his embezzlement. The jury didn't see a Vance. They saw a man who had stolen from his wife, his company, and his father. Julian tried to testify, claiming I had manipulated Arthur into giving me the trust. But then, my team played a video Arthur had recorded just weeks before his death. "If you're watching this," Arthur's image said, "it's because my son has failed. Maya is the only one who understands that wealth is a responsibility, not a birthright." Julian broke down in the witness stand. The audit was final. With the Vance family legally dismantled, I began the liquidation of the ego. I auctioned off Eleanor's couture collection, Julian's vintage Ferraris, and the remaining family villas. The proceeds, hundreds of millions, went into the Silas Foundation. I kept nothing for myself but the mansion. I didn't keep it for the luxury. I kept it to remind myself of the girl who was once called the Help. I turned the West Wing into a library for the scholarship students who, like me, came from nothing. The house was no longer a monument to a bloodline. It was a factory for the future. I visited Eleanor before she was moved to her permanent facility. She sat behind the glass, her skin looking like crumpled paper, her eyes devoid of their fire. "You think you won?" she hissed. "But you're still just a girl from the slums playing dress-up." "No, Eleanor," I said. "A girl playing dress-up cares what people think of her clothes. I care about the balance sheet. And right now, your account with humanity is at 0. You killed a man who tolerated you. You tried to ruin a woman who served you. Your bloodline ends in a cell. Mine begins in a boardroom." I stood up and walked away, not even waiting for her response. She was a ghost I had finally exorcised. A year later, Silas Global was the top-performing real estate firm in the country. We weren't just building skyscrapers, we were building communities. I was on the cover of Fortune, not as a socialite, but as a CEO. I received a letter from Julian's lawyers asking for a pittance from the trust to help him with his legal appeals. I didn't even open it. I sent it to the shredder file. Julian had spent his whole life thinking he was the landlord of the world. Now he was just a tenant in a prison cell I helped build. My father's ghost was finally at peace. The trust that had been hidden for 40 years was now the most powerful force in the industry. I sat in the garden of the mansion, watching the new scholarship students walk the grounds. They didn't look at me with fear or resentment, they looked at me with hope. I realized that the inherited sabotage wasn't what the Vances did to me, it was what Arthur did to them. He knew that the only way to save the Vance legacy was to give it to someone who didn't care about the name. I stood on the balcony where Eleanor had once stood to watch me be evicted. The sun was setting over the estate, casting a long golden light over the Silas Global logo on the distant skyline. I pulled the Zurich key from my pocket and looked at it one last time. It wasn't a key to a box anymore. It was the key to my own freedom. I had started as a nanny, an interloper, a glorified servant. I ended as the architect of a new world. I dropped the key into the fountain below and walked back inside. The books were balanced. The audit was complete. And for the first time in my life, the house was truly mine.